In 2004, Vladimir Putin faced one of his toughest challenges ever, and the way he handled it showed the world the ruthless dictator he would become. On the first day of the school year, dozens of Chechen rebellions stormed School Number 1 in Beslan, a town in Russia's North Caucasus Republic of Ossetia, taking over 1,200 people hostage and holding them for 3 days. Tragically, 334 people lost their lives, the majority of them children. All because Putin wanted to consolidate power and continue his war in Chechnya no matter the cost. Instead of prioritizing the safety of his citizens, Putin made decisions that ensured two things. He would limit democracy and consolidate his power, and his war in Chechnya would continue at all costs. Putin's detachment from the tragedy, along with the systematic distortion of facts using his political power, state-controlled media, and security services, serves as a constant reminder to some Russians of the corruption and greed that drive their political system and leader. To understand why this hostage crisis happened, we have to go back and look at the Chechen War. This video covers the truth that Putin has long tried hiding, so I'm certain that Russian bots will try to downvote it in the algorithm. So if you can help us out and just hit the like button below. If you enjoyed the story, please share the video on social media. It just helps us fight against Russian bots. Chechnya has a long history of striving for independence from its large and powerful neighbor, Russia. This region has always been a strategic asset for Russia, securing its position on the Black Sea and providing access to the Mediterranean Sea. In the mid-19th century, Russia conquered Chechnya, stripping it of its independence and making it part of the Russian Empire. Despite this, a number of Chechens have always believed in their right to sovereignty, but Russia was simply too powerful to challenge. Chechen rebels believe they have a right to independence because they see Chechnya as culturally different from much of Russia. The people there are predominantly Muslim, unlike the mostly Orthodox Christian population in the rest of the country, and they speak their own language. This isn't the first time Russia's been possessive over its former colonial territories. Consider Ukraine, Georgia, and Poland, for example. These three nations have their own distinct languages, cultures, and histories, and were colonized by Russia against their will in previous centuries. Yet, even in modern times, Russia has repeatedly tried to assert control over them. Under Stalin and the leaders who followed, the Chechens, Georgians, and Ukrainians' desire for independence was harshly suppressed, maintaining the status quo for decades. However, when the Soviet Union collapsed, hopes for their independence were reignited. In Chechnya, this came on October 7, 1991, when Zokhar Dudayev became president and declared Chechnya's independence a few days later. Moscow immediately challenged this declaration, but couldn't do much due to the upheaval following the Soviet Union's collapse. The issue was critical for Boris Yeltsin, Russia's new president elected in 1991. It was so important to him that he issued secret, unconstitutional war decrees in November and December 1994 to invade Chechnya. By June 1995, Russian forces had inflicted at least 30,000 casualties, including thousands of children. Although a treaty was signed in 1996, the conflict was far from over. In 1999, Vladimir Putin started the Second Chechen War after a series of bombings attributed to Chechen terrorists killed 300 people and injured over 1,000 in residential areas near Moscow. These bombings occurred just 1 month after Putin was appointed prime minister. Some political historians and analysts believe that these attacks might have been orchestrated by Putin and the FSB, Russia's intelligence agency, to bolster his position as the heir apparent to then-President Boris Yeltsin. Before these events, Putin had largely remained in the background of Russian politics. He'd spent many years serving the KGB, the Soviet Union's intelligence agency, and had been a deputy mayor in Leningrad. His first major national role came in 1998, when he became the head of the FSB. Remarkably, just over a year later, he was appointed prime minister and ultimately became the acting president of Russia. Historians believe that Vladimir Putin, lacking a significant political base or extensive leadership experience, needed to rally the Russian people to support him in the presidential election following Boris Yeltsin's resignation. Some theories suggest that the 1999 apartment bombings attributed to Chechen terrorists may have been orchestrated to bolster Putin's image as a strong leader. Reports emerged that would-be bombers were captured by local police and were allegedly FSB officers, claiming they were conducting a training exercise with sacks full of sugar. Regardless of these allegations, Russians were in a state of panic, and Putin needed to appear decisive. Just over a month after becoming acting president, Russian forces entered Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, committing grave abuses, including war crimes. Graffiti on the walls ominously read, "Welcome to Hell Part 2, and the Russian troops weren't hesitant to fulfill that grim promise. They targeted innocent civilians, blatantly violating the Geneva Convention. Russian forces executed at least 200 civilians and falsely detained over 1,000 people, causing thousands to flee as refugees." About a month later, Vladimir Putin, the once obscure bureaucrat, won Russia's presidency with 53% of the vote. By 2002, during the Moscow theater hostage crisis, Putin's war in Chechnya was still dragging on. By this point, over 25,000 Chechen civilians had lost their lives, and an estimated 300,000 people had been displaced from their homes. The war had also become unpopular among the Russian public. A retired Russian general pointed out that in just 2 years, Russia had lost as many soldiers as the United States did in its 10-year war in Afghanistan. Moreover, 64% of the population supported peaceful negotiations with the Chechen separatists. Despite all this, Putin remained steadfast in his refusal to engage in any form of peaceful negotiation with the Chechens. This stubborn stance prompted the rebels to resort to terrorist activities within Russia, aiming to force him to come to the negotiating table. The Moscow theater hostage crisis happened in 2002, when about 40 Chechen rebels invaded a theater in Moscow, taking 970 people hostage. As you guys know, YouTube has a habit of restricting our videos, and sometimes it's not even YouTube's fault. It's the brands that run ads on YouTube. They don't want their ads next to controversial videos. So they tell YouTube to restrict controversial videos like ours that cover geopolitics. That means sometimes we have to forego covering certain news topics because we know YouTube will restrict that video. But often those controversial topics are important news that you guys ought to know about. That's why we launched Global Recaps, our own geopolitics newsletter. Every day, we send an email directly to your inbox covering the world's most important news, and there's no third-party censoring any topic. If it's important, it'll be in the email so you all can know about it. These are short and simple emails that take 5 minutes to read. News topics covered in the emails are unbiased, uncensored, and completely free. So sign up now by scanning the QR code on screen or using the link in the description, and become more knowledgeable about the world you live in. Back to the video. The elected Chechen president Beslan offered to mediate with the hostage takers to save the hostages. However, Russian forces decided to storm the building instead, putting the hostages at risk and preventing his intervention. By the end of the 4-day siege, Russian officers had filled the theater with a mysterious, still unidentified gas before launching their assault. This resulted in the reported deaths of 40 hostage takers and 129 civilians. Some sources suggest that the actual civilian death toll was over 200, and that at least one hostage taker may have escaped. The Russian forces' aggressive attempt to end the crisis quickly, even at the cost of civilian lives, was widely condemned. Yet a similar scenario unfolded in 2004 during the Beslan school attack. By that time, Russia's occupation of Chechnya was still ongoing, with an additional 10,000 Russian soldiers killed and at least 50,000 wounded. Despite these heavy casualties, Putin remained steadfast, rejecting the Chechen rebels' demands to end the war in Chechnya. Which leads us to the most devastating attack on Russian soil in modern Russia's history, the Beslan siege. The government's official story claimed that 32 Chechen terrorists armed with weapons and homemade explosives managed to travel undetected through Russia by driving an army truck from neighboring Ingushetia. However, historians believe this number was significantly underreported, with witnesses corroborating that the real figure was between 50 and 80. This discrepancy suggests that the state's claim of exterminating 31 terrorists and capturing one alive was inaccurate, as dozens of hostage-takers escaped. Independent reports indicated that even the leader of the assault, Ruslan Kuchbarov, was believed by some to still be at large months after the siege. Gunshots were heard elsewhere in the city almost a full day after the siege had ended, seemingly confirming these suspicions. Additionally, these escapees would have been hard to detect, since many were likely ethnic Ossetians who could easily blend in with the local population. When the Chechen rebels took over the school, the state-run media reported that there were only 354 hostages. This claim led the attackers to stop providing water to the hostages and to threaten that they would only return 354 of them alive. Meanwhile, the fate of approximately 1,200 hostages hung in the balance. Instead of broadcasting comprehensive news coverage, the state-run media aired soap operas and films, forcing people to seek updates through independent newspapers, radio, and blogs. Putin and Russia's political leaders remained nearly silent, and information about the tragic events emerged slowly. Putin even declared at the time that Russia had been attacked by Al-Qaeda. He hasn't repeated it since, due to its obvious lack of credibility. During the siege, the Chechen hostage-takers demanded that Putin end his invasion of Chechnya and release around 30 previously captured rebels. The Russian government dismissed these demands as unrealistic, so negotiations stalled, a decision that led to significant criticism after the attack. The hostage-takers gathered families, teachers, and children and began executing the male hostages to prevent any uprising. Even though most of the civilians were children, this didn't push Putin toward peaceful negotiation. The tension kept escalating until, on the third day, it finally reached a breaking point. A sudden explosion shook the hostages to their core. Shortly after, a second blast went off, plunging everyone into mass confusion. The bombing of the roof sparked a fire, and the subsequent collapse led to the deaths of 160 civilians. The Russian government claimed that the hostage-takers, who they said had planned suicide bombings from the beginning, were responsible for bombing the roof. They further stated that the hostages took advantage of the chaos to flee the gym from all directions. According to the government, this prompted the militants to start shooting at the escaping hostages, which in turn forced the Russian military to storm the building to attack the terrorists, even if it meant putting some hostages in danger. However, witness reports and independent investigations suggested a different story. They found that the initial explosions might have come from outside the building, implying that Russian forces launched them to create an excuse to storm the school. Alternatively, it's possible that one of the Russian snipers targeted a rebel holding a detonator, which led to at least one of the blasts. These reports also claimed that the fire and collapse of the roof were caused by military-grade flamethrowers and 6 anti-personnel high-explosive tank shells, all fired while the hostages were still inside. The Russian military denied using these weapons while hostages were at risk. Orders for such extreme measures were likely to have come from the highest levels of authority, possibly even Putin himself, since not even the defense minister has the authority to order tank fire in Russia. General Viktor Sobolev, who was in charge of the tank used by the Russian authorities, confirmed this, saying that he was ordered to hand over the tanks to the FSB before the shells were fired. It's no wonder that the European Court of Human Rights later ruled that Russia's use of indiscriminate force was a failure in the government's duty to protect the hostages. Experts have debunked the Russian government's claim that the violent storming of the school was spontaneous. For instance, Pavel Felgenhauer, an independent defense analyst, pointed out that the first helicopter arrived just 17 minutes after the attack began, even though helicopters typically take 30 minutes to warm up their engines before flight. Moreover, by the morning of September 3rd, before the supposedly spontaneous raid, the area near the school had been expanded by removing fences, creating space for an assault on the building. Local hospitals were also preparing for a large number of patients. These details suggest that the assault was planned in advance rather than being an immediate reaction, meaning the government knowingly put its citizens at risk to end the siege rapidly. Just like in 2002, it was in Putin's best interest to conclude the attack as quickly as possible, even at the cost of civilian lives. Shamil Basayev, a now deceased Chechen warlord and Russia's most wanted man at the time, claimed responsibility for ordering the attack. He sparked even more outrage by alleging that Russian officials had allowed the attackers safe passage. Basayev claimed that a security service agent had been sent undercover to a Chechen rebel group to convince them to attack Vladikavkaz, the capital of North Ossetia. At the last minute, the Russian undercover agent supposedly permitted a change of plan, with the new target being Beslan. The Russian government dismissed these claims as utter nonsense. However, independent analysts have found some evidence suggesting that Russian authorities might have known about the attack beforehand. Yet, there was no effort to bolster security for the residents of Beslan. Some residents suspected that the police had been bribed to stay away from the school, and witnesses believed that weapons and explosives had been planted in the school before the hostage-takers arrived. Independent investigations also uncovered that many of the attackers were in prison until just before the raid, and Russian officials purportedly released them just in time for the attack. Additionally, some believe that Putin had incentives to allow this attack to happen, given the increasingly unpopular Chechen war. The wave of sympathy for victims following the mysterious 1999 bombings attributed to Chechen terrorists had been a catalyst for Putin's rise to popularity. With allegations of his potential involvement in those events, some suggest that he might have been using a similar strategy from his established playbook. The difference was that this time the public was less supportive of his ongoing war. Throughout his rule, Putin has repeatedly shown a willingness to sacrifice much to fulfill his ambitions and maintain power. In the Beslan tragedy, 186 children lost their lives. While Putin did visit Beslan shortly after the siege, many felt his response was distant and inadequate. Instead of holding a public meeting to address the residents who were forever scarred by the tragedy, he met privately with only a few mothers. This reflects a hallmark of his presidency: small, pre-vetted gatherings where everything is under control. If Russia's strongman leader couldn't fully face his own people, what does that tell us about his nature? Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Putin's leadership was his first official action after the Beslan siege. He canceled direct elections for governors in Russia's 89 regions, opting instead for direct appointments to supposedly improve security. It wasn't clear how this move would enhance security. It seemed more like another chess move to consolidate his power. When the motion was put to a vote in parliament, opposition leaders protested it as a step towards dictatorship. Now, 20 years later, there's virtually no opposition. Putin's history shows that he never lets a good crisis go to waste. He would stop at nothing to achieve his ambitions. The detached way Putin treated the victims of the Beslan attack is unsurprising, considering his reaction to the 2000 Kursk submarine sinking. Back then, he took 5 days to interrupt a skiing holiday on the Black Sea before meeting with the angry relatives. As a newly minted leader, he was inexperienced and decided to address them all. They tore him to pieces. Since then, he learned his lesson and chose to meet with small, pre-vetted crowds. During his televised meeting with the 3 vetted mothers from Beslan, he made a mistake by stating that only 136 children had died, omitting the tragic loss of 50 additional innocent lives, even 20 years later. Putin's tendency to minimize the most tragic attack in modern Russia's history became a recurring theme in the years that followed. 8 years into his presidency, he held a press conference where he spoke extensively about his administration's successes and expressed his belief that there had been no serious failures during his term. This declaration struck a chord with the residents of Beslan, whose attempts to uncover the truth had been met with strong resistance and indifference from the state. A group called A Voice of Beslan, which demanded an inquiry into the Beslan attack, was ignored by the authorities and harassed by intelligence agencies and state-controlled media. The FSB attended the group's meetings and confiscated their documents. Additionally, the state-controlled media launched a smear campaign against them, claiming the group was being manipulated by unidentified political figures trying to sow division in Russia. Eventually, the group was shut down due to a court order that they were told came from the highest levels. Putin's actions suggested that he would rather silence the victims of the assault than hold anyone in his administration accountable. Despite Putin's calm exterior, he's consistently worked behind the scenes to limit public criticism and consolidate his power and influence. He used the state's authority to crack down on Russian oligarchs who refused to submit to his rule. He established a complaint parliament, restricted the power of regional governors, and took control of the media. Moreover, he's been notoriously ruthless towards his critics at home, with many mysteriously poisoned, bombed, or detained. So, given Putin's clear track record of pursuing his ambitions at any cost, what was the aftermath of the Beslan attack? Public outrage after the attack, stemming from numerous unanswered questions about its causes and the government's handling, forced Putin to launch an internal government investigation, even though the people demanded a public inquiry. The Kremlin promised that the parliamentary commission headed by Alexander Torshin and composed of politicians loyal to Putin would uncover the facts and report the truth. The Russian government's version of the story was detailed in a report informed by the commission's investigations in the court case prosecuting Nurpashy Kuliev, the sole surviving hostage-taker. This 2-year investigation led to revelations that, in the government's eyes, closed the matter. However, many Russians felt the investigation was inadequate and the conclusions dishonest. They believed that the government was hiding behind falsehoods because the truth would implicate both their system and their leader, Vladimir Putin. Full blame was placed on the rebels, and Russian officials' conduct was deemed appropriate. The individuals the public felt were responsible for their children's deaths were instead given promotions and awards by Putin's regime. The fact that the one hostage-taker who was captured was jailed for life did little to comfort the residents of Beslan, who were scarred for life. The political consequences for Putin after the Beslan attack have been lukewarm. While some residents of Beslan vowed never to vote for him again, others continue to support him, believing that the mistakes were not his fault, but the result of bad actors around him. Many relatives of the victims have lost hope of ever discovering the full truth about what happened during that tragic assault. What is certain is that Putin's immense power and influence in Russia suggests that he must have been involved in the critical decisions that led to the nightmare of the Beslan siege, a tragedy that still haunts the nation and Putin's legacy today. As we've seen, the siege was a result of Putin's war in Chechnya. Since then, Putin has also invaded Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014 and 2022, causing significant regional instability, tens of thousands of deaths, and widespread international condemnation. But that begs the question, why has Putin been so insistent on keeping conflicts going? War has been a key pillar in Vladimir Putin's strategy to sustain his long tenure in power. Since 2000, he has led Russia, making him the longest-serving Kremlin leader since Joseph Stalin. Throughout his time in office, Putin has engaged in conflicts involving Chechnya, Georgia, and Ukraine. Russia's military-industrial complex plays a significant role in its economy. Industries like missile manufacturing, vehicle production, and artillery ammunition contribute notably to economic growth. Experts estimate that up to a third of Russia's economic growth is driven by the war machine, meaning it's important for both national defense and economic stimulation. Additionally, Russia maintains a massive military force, with 3.57 million troops as of 2024, with 37% of them, or 1.32 million, being active military personnel. This places Russia among the top 3 countries with the largest militaries, alongside the United States and China. Military ranks and career progression are important aspects of soldiers' lives and are deeply ingrained in Russian culture as a whole. Some political analysts argue that without the war machine, Russia's generals and soldiers would have little to occupy themselves with. Wars provide the Russian military with opportunities for career progression, a sense of mission, and access to large financial flows under the pretext of rebuilding budgets for infrastructure and housing in occupied territories. Even though many Russians don't support these wars, acknowledging the greed and corruption involved, they still support their military personnel. This support makes the wars more tolerable for the public. Feeding the metaphorical beast of the military-industrial complex has allowed Putin to remain politically unchallenged for the past 24 years. By keeping the military satisfied with wars that bring them substantial funding and opportunities for career advancement, Putin has solidified his rule by gaining and maintaining their critical support. This gives him much more freedom to deploy them when it suits his purposes. For example, during the 2004 Beslan attack, the military raided the hostage-filled gymnasium, leading to more than half of the recorded civilian deaths. A fiasco like that would likely lead to the downfall of most leaders around the world, even dictators, as many have been overthrown or assassinated by their own troops in the past. However, Putin maintains control over every aspect of Russia's political, social, and economic infrastructure through his mutually beneficial relationship with the military. In conclusion, Putin's reign has consistently relied on conflict to strengthen his hold on power. From the early days of the Chechen War to the more recent invasions of Georgia and Ukraine, he's used military engagements to project strength and distract from internal issues. These wars have fueled Russia's economy through the military-industrial complex and secured the loyalty of the armed forces. By portraying Russia as a nation under threat, he's justified tightening control over the media and suppressing opposition. This strategy has allowed him to maintain power for over 2 decades, but it raises serious questions about the cost to the Russian people and the stability of the region. Will this approach continue to serve him? Or will it ultimately lead to his downfall?